So we are now recording. Thank you. Now I'll get going here. Well, again, good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Williamson. I'm the branch manager of the Milton Library, here with Vicki Bean, the branch manager of the Adams Park Library, and with Dr. W. Jeffrey Bolster, author of Black Jacks, African-American Seamen in the Age of Sail. We're here tonight as we do a quick discussion and conversation about this book and this small micro history of African Americans in America. Everyone is on mute at this time. If not, please mute yourself if you can for us. Any questions that you have, if you'll please put them in the chat function for us. We will be monitoring that chat function. We'll get to your questions there. Dr. Bolster has a quick presentation for us. I do have some leading questions that hopefully will continue our conversation through the next 30, 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, and then we'll get a chance to look in the chat function and ask the questions in chat. So again, we'd like to welcome Dr. W. Jeffrey Bolster, retired history professor from the University of New Hampshire, who is hanging out in the heartland of America out in Colorado right now as we speak. So he's nowhere near the ocean, but I know he is longing for that time to get back on the ocean and sail around the world. So Dr. Bolster, go ahead and get us started here tonight. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Okay, thanks, Todd. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My talk tonight is about Black ancestors overcoming great odds. It's really a talk about the indomitable spirit of Black sailors in the age of slavery. African-American men, seamen on ships, were crucial, just central to Black Americans' freedom struggle, to their economic survival, to their sense of self, really to the creation of the diaspora. Black sailors connected the brothers and sisters of the diaspora long before print media, vinyl LP albums, or other means of connection. It's an epic story, part of the creation of Black America, and yet this story was ignored or suppressed for a very long time. I've given talks like this hundreds of times, and I've never said this before, but I'll say it now. There are forces at work in our society at this moment that are trying to stop people like me from talking to people like you about the Black past, about slavery, about what went down in America. In my estimation, it's criminal. It's like book banning. It's now called critical race theory. But the one thing we can do is try to vote against it. Okay, so I'm just really apoplectic about what's happening in our country in terms of the past. But I'll get back to my story. As a young man, or I wrote this book to try to set the record straight, you know. As a young man, I was fortunate to sail for about 10 years on sailing ships as mate and captain, ships like this, often in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, I was fortunate enough in the 1970s to run into owner-operated cargo boats under sail, sailed by Black West Indians. And I was in places like Anguilla, St. Bart's, and others. I'm talking to guys like this about their lives. And they're telling me about jamming their sloops hard on the wind from Virgin Gorda to St. Martin, or they're telling me about carrying cattle under sail from Tortola to the Dominican Republic. And I have no idea I'm going to write this book years later. I'm just a young guy sailing, but these guys struck a chord with me. And one night in 1978, we're sailing into Cape Haitian, Haiti, school ship program, university students. And the professor on board loaned me a book written by a slave, a Black man from the 1790s. He'd been sailing in the 1770s, Hola, Equiano. Amazing book. And I read it and I thought, what are the connections between this enslaved sailor 200 years ago and men like the one on my screen here that I was talking to not long ago? What sort of maritime traditions connected Black America? This is the picture that most people use to associate historic Black people with historic sailing ships. It's real, it's powerful, it's important. We can't lose sight of it, but it's not the whole story. And it hides, as does this one, other truths, competing truths, real truths. Men like this. You look at this picture, Black people on a historic sailing ship, and this picture, Black people on a historic sailing ship, and they tell very different stories. And a lot of people knew about the slave ship story, and very few people knew about this story. Men like this, skilled, competent, cosmopolitan. And I thought that we could learn something about these men's background, their families, their reputations, what drove them, how did they make themselves in their era? Well, that's all great to say. You know, I'm a historian, I have questions. But how do you do it? How do you pull it off? This is a crew list. This is a document generated by the American government. Since the 1790s, the US government has required every American ship leaving an American port to have a list, a registered list of who are the people on board, the sailors and otherwise passengers. This is the crew list. If you can see it, this is one from Rhode Island in 1806, but the second column from the right says complexion. The far right column says hair. The second column from the right says complexion. And you'll notice it says brown, and then it says black man, and then it says ditto, 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 ditto. And then one final addition in the left, black man. So here's a crew with a white captain and a mate, and otherwise the entire crew is men of color, okay? There are tens of thousands of these crew lists in various archives in the United States Archives. And I went through many, many thousands of them. And I created a statistical backbone for this book that would demonstrate very clearly in the captain's own handwriting how many men aboard his ship were African-American men, and sometimes Native American men, at different times. So I created this statistical backbone for this story. But the guts of my book, it's got some statistics, it's got these facts in it, they're important. But the guts of my book are stories about individual men making themselves in these days. So let's start here. Havana Harbor, Cuba, 1749. The guy in the water named Watson, he went swimming, he was a sailor on a cargo ship, and the shark got to him and got his leg before his shipmates bailed him out, saved him. 30 years later, Watson was not going to sea anymore. He only had one leg, but he had made some money as a merchant, and he commissioned a very famous artist, John Singleton Copley, who painted this, to paint the picture of the day that changed his life. And when Copley gave Watson the sketches, it was an all-white crew in the boat. And Watson said, no, wait a minute. One of the guys that pulled me out that day, my shipmate, was a black man. Put him in the picture. This is a true story. I use this story not to suggest that race was meaningless aboard ship. That would be silly. I use this story not to suggest that black men didn't, bear most of the burdens of race aboard ship, because they did. But I use the story to show that the way race worked aboard ship was different, certainly than in plantation societies and some places ashore. Watson wanted his black shipmate to be remembered. Copley presented him to us. It turns out that in the 1700s and the early 1800s, maritime slavery was essential to the functioning of the economy. You get a plantation society like Georgia or Barbados, a commercial society like New York and Boston, maritime slavery, crucial. Here's a small boat in Barbados. It's connecting the shore to the ship, an anchored cargo ship. There's no big dock, there's no big pier. You connect the ship to the shore with a small boat. Small boats in slave societies are all manned by slaves. So here's a group of Barbadian slaves carrying hogsheads or casks of sugar or rum out to the cargo ship. Here's one from Georgia. This is painted, sketched in Georgia, 1739. This is a pettiauger, as it's called, a local small boat. It would have been sailed in around St. Simon's Island, Jekyll Island, Sapelo Sound, Cumberland Island, the Georgia waterways, that maze, that network of extraordinary waterways up to Savannah, etc., manned by slaves, slave skipper, slave crew, carrying plantation goods. Here's another one in Antigua, very well-dressed slaves. That's a little artistic license. But the point here is that these slaves are rolling casks of sugar out to a small boat that will be taken out to the sloop or the schooner, sailed around the coast, all by slaves, to where the cargo ships in St. John are loading. So what do we see? We see that there's a mechanism by which sailors, white and black, from Boston or London are anchored in Antigua to collect cargoes, and locally enslaved men are transporting those cargoes to the ship. There's a mechanism here for enslaved people, whether in Antigua or Savannah or wherever, to connect with sailors on deep sea ships, whether white or black. Check out this one. Here's a cabin boy in a British warship. The warship's clearly at anchor because women, possibly prostitutes, were not aboard ship when they were at sea. So they're in port somewhere. you can see that black boy up there in the back is reading a book. So here we have a world in which young black men are in the Navy and traveling the world and seeing things and even being exposed to literacy, a very different world from people in plantation slavery. One more image like this. This is the aft cabin of a British warship. Great party. I don't know if you've ever been to a party where people got so drunk they put wigs on the dog or not, but that's what's apparently happening here. So the black man in the background is the musician. He's clearly beating on the drum, and these white gentlemen are sitting around a table. My point here is that enslaved black males often got aboard ship as cabin servants, cabin stewards, cooks, musicians. A black man who could blow the French horn or beat the drum was a sign of prestige to a white captain. So once these black men got aboard ship in those service roles, lo and behold, they often became skilled sailors. Here we have a soldier, a black man from the British West Indian Regiment in Jamaica, and back behind him, there's another soldier talking to a sailor. These are all men of African descent. The sailor is an able-bodied seaman in the Royal Navy. So there's this mechanism by which enslaved people in a system that depends on maritime slavery often get to sea.
Dr. Bolster, can I interrupt you just for a minute?
Yeah.
I think your slide show went to thumbnails again. So can you perhaps change that?
Yeah, I will try. Let's see.
Okay.
I've lost my...
Perhaps from current
Yes.
slide. Yes.
Yeah, I'd go from current slide if I can do that.
Yes.
No,
There
that's, no. Well, I
Yeah.
got it as the first slide.
Okay, I see.
Sorry, team. We'll go back to... How's that? Is that better?
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
All right. Sorry for tech problems. So here's an image. These are just American tobacco ships in the 1770s, Revolutionary War era. But ships like this became a refuge for slaves on the land. Ships like this became a work environment in which race worked differently than in some ways ashore. Ships like this became a means by which black men could communicate around the diaspora. One little story, there's thousands of these guys. In 1756, black man in Bermuda, he'd been raised in Bermuda. His name was Thias, and he was we're told, a very good ship caulker and a competent ship carpenter. He's Bermuda born, Bermuda bred. He's working there in a shipyard, knows his way around the water, and his master sells him to a different owner in St. Eustatius. Bermuda, you might know, is about 600 miles due east of North Carolina, 700 miles south of Rhode Island, about 800 miles north of the Eastern Caribbean. It's out in the middle. So Thias is sent to St. Eustatius in the Caribbean. He doesn't like it. How do I know that? Well, because he ran away. His people are in Bermuda. So after 8 months, he shows up again in Bermuda, not at his master's house, but he wants to see friends, family. But the heat is too great. His master is looking for him. So Thias, 14 months later, we're told, is now in South Carolina, being, quote, harbored by a wench. Some woman in Charleston or another place in South Carolina is helping him out. I get all this information from some runaway slave advertisements in the South Carolina Gazette, but it's one little story to show black men in motion at a time when the system really wanted them to be fixed in place, to show how a black sailor could use his maritime skills to get around, and to show how other people of color, whether in St. Eustatius, in Bermuda, or in Charleston, are helping this brother as he's on the move. Here's some books. This is outrageous, but it turns out that the first 6 autobiographies written by black men in the English language were all written by sailors. It's like, whoa, what's going down? Well, it turns out that ships were literate places. The aft cabin of a ship has books. It's got charts. It's got maps. It's got navigation instruments. Sailors could learn to read if they worked in the aft cabin. And ships go to major port cities like London and Boston and New York, which means that an aspiring author can find a patron. So the one on the left here, The Life of Equiano, Hola, Acquiano, that's the one I read years ago going into Cape Haitian. It's awesome. It is the most important book written by a black man in the 1790s. opening salvo, an indictment of the slave trade and slavery. The one to the right, the life, history, and unparalleled suffering of John G., the African preacher. G was another sailor who wrote a book, and there's 6 of these guys that I explore in my book. I could talk about them all night. They're very interesting. Olada Equiano, compelling guy, brilliant intellect, wonderful writer. He was born in an Igbo man in what we think of as Nigeria, sent to the Caribbean, then to Virginia, ended up in the Royal Navy, then back to the Caribbean as a sailor, slave sailor, ultimately freed. Very, very influential in the struggle for freedom by Blacks in the late 18th, early 19th century. John G., born in Old Calabar, Nigeria, sent to New York when he was just a few years old as a slave, gets free in the American Revolution, doesn't get formally free, just takes off. But he went to sea because he wanted to spread the gospels that he cared about. Methodist evangelism, revolutionary egalitarianism, sort of a nascent Black nationalism. He hated ships in the sea. Equiano was actually a good seaman. G didn't like it, but it let him get 3 meals and a place to sleep, and it let him go from place to place to talk about what mattered to him and to other people of color, he thought. Captain Paul Cuffey, his father was an Ashanti man, a West African brought to America. His mother was a Wampanoag Indian woman, a native woman. Cuffey becomes the most well-to-do and famous Black man in America of his generation. Ship owner, shipbuilder, whaling captain, cargo captain. Ultimately, Cuffey decided to throw his lot with the emigrationists who were trying to campaign for free Black people in America to go to Africa, go back to Africa. Cuffey, the wealthiest Black man of his generation, he said, Black people here are never going to get a chance in America. It's never going to work. We should go to Africa and bring capitalism and Christianity and try to make a go of it there. James Fortin, Black man of the same generation, a well-to-do sailmaker in Philadelphia who, like Cuffey, had gone to sea as a young man. He said, absolutely not, Brother Cuffey. They were friends. They knew each other. They corresponded. I've read their correspondence. They argued, as Black leaders often do, about different things. But they were respected in this vision because they were both cosmopolitan intellectuals. They had seen the world. They had each been a lot of places, and they had this different vision for what would become of Black people in the future, whether staying in America, which Fortin said we've made with our blood, sweat, and tears, or whether going to Africa for a better start, as Cuffey argued. So this is the kind of workplace that those men knew. You know, this ship, this is the Abula. I love this painting. The painting's owned by Mystic Seaport, but it's an American ship sailing into a French port, painted by an Italian artist with a multiracial crew on deck. It's a real sort of multicultural thing. One of the 2-man midships on the vessel on the deck is clearly a Black man, painted as such by the artist. He's probably the cook. The foresheet, one of the ropes that controls the big lower sail, is called the cook's rope. The point here is that the artist at the time took pains to depict a Black man in that role. The other point is that the skilled Black sailors aboard ships like this were not just proletarians who didn't know anything. They were able-bodied seamen. They could control this vessel. They could send down yards, set sails, reef sails, steer in a gale, retrieve a fouled anchor. They had a skill, and they were proud of that skill. It's also dangerous. Here's Billy Waters. He fell from the rigging of a ship and lost his leg to the surgeon's saw. He ended up his days begging on the streets of London, although he was American-born, with his peg leg and his fiddle, trying to make a living, busking for money on the street corner as a worn-out sailor. Another ship portrait where the artist took pains to depict the Black men up on the foredeck to the right, the white men on the quarterdeck to the left. Why do I say this? Vicki and Todd, this is tough, but I'm going to land one on the chin of your profession. As I was researching this book, I went to many libraries and many archives all up and down the East Coast, used material from Europe and the Caribbean. A number of well-intentioned librarians and archivists would say to me, what are you doing? And I say, well, I'm writing a book about Black seamen. Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but you're probably not going to find much. Black people don't really sail. Black people don't really do the water. I heard this from Black librarians and white ones, from old ones and young ones, from men and women. I heard it so many times in Maryland and Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. and other places. It's just after a while, I said, well, thank you very much, but let's look in your collection and see what we got. It turns out, my friends, that this book that I wrote is research on an incredible trove of evidence. There are legal records and jail records and shipping records and plantation records and merchants records and diaries and novels and you name it. And there are also, as I've been showing you here this evening, a lot of pictures. In fact, these pictures are hiding in plain sight. They are places like on the wall at the US Naval Academy Library, on the wall in the Museum of Modern Art in Boston, on the wall in the Royal Library in Copenhagen, on the wall in London, England. You get what I'm getting at here. Librarians and archivists trying to help me out and keep me from what they thought was a wild goose chase had been affected by race. All of us can't help but see the world through the lens of race. You know, we grow up in this culture and it affects us in different ways, but race is out there and it's a factor. So the vision was that Black people don't do boats and thus they didn't do boats in the past. Well, that vision is entirely wrong. It's a racialized vision. So if there's any young people in the audience tonight, you know, I would just say to you, don't believe the whole story has been told. As Bob Marley and Peter Tosh said years ago, half the story has never been told. And go out and, you know, seek your own project, look to uncover some stories, because these are big and powerful stories from the past. And they're not only suppressed sometimes, in this case, by folks who don't want to hear about slavery or folks who don't want to hear about the Black past in any way that's more noble, but it's also people who are well-intentioned, but who have just been influenced by race. So I guess I'm trying to say to you, question what you're often told. You might get new answers. War of 1812, American fleet, again, Black man in the boat. Again, these images are very common. Okay. We all know him, Frederick Douglass, greatest Black American of his generation, a brilliant man. He's born in slavery on the eastern shore of Maryland. And as a kid growing up on the Chesapeake Bay, he says, I watched the ships come by loose from their moorings and free while I'm here chained in my slavery, fast in my slavery. And he swore, this very bay, this Chesapeake Bay will take me to freedom. His master, though, sent him to Baltimore. Here's the Baltimore waterfront, and sent him to a shipyard where he learned to caulk ships. Here, about a century later, is a photograph of a Black caulker caulking ships. That big hammer, that mallet in his hand, is used to drive the caulking in between the planks. So Douglass is working in shipyards in Baltimore, and he learns to read. Kids in the shipyard, white kids, teach him to read, really against the law, but they do. And he's brilliant, so he catches on quickly. And ultimately, he wants to get out of slavery. So what does Douglass do? He finds a free Black sailor in Maryland, a brave man who offers to give Frederick Douglass this document. This is a Seaman's Protection Certificate. This isn't one Douglass used, but it's one issued to another Black man. You get these at any customs port, and it defined the bearer, as you'll see at the bottom, as a citizen of the United States. So this free Black man risked 7 years in the penitentiary or a $300 fine to give Frederick Douglass his protection certificate. Douglass dresses in sailor's clothes. He gets on the train in Baltimore, heading for Philadelphia. And when the conductor comes down the aisle and asks the people of color for their free pass, Douglass said, I reached into my deep sailor's pocket, I pulled out my certificate, and I said to him, I don't have a free pass, but I have my certificate with the American Eagle at the top. I can go anywhere in the world. And the conductor said, okay, dude, go to Philly. So free Black sailors were so common at that point that they didn't even cause second looks. That's really the point of the story. George Henry, here dressed as a free man in Rhode Island. He grew up as a slave sailor in the Chesapeake. He became a skipper, a captain of schooners like this, a pungy schooner. He had 4 men under him, sailing all around the Chesapeake Bay, making money for their master. He knew all the ports, Chestertown, Annapolis, Norfolk, Baltimore, whatever. In 1858, he said, I went to Baltimore and tied up this schooner. I was making so much money for my master, they didn't appreciate me. And I escaped. I went to Providence, Rhode Island. He said, but you know what? In Providence, I had to come down from my high position as captain. They said, you can go as cook on a schooner, or you can just pick up your whitewash brush or your wheelbarrow and make a living that way. So as a skilled slave, he could work in a slave society, the Chesapeake Bay, making money for white people. But as a free man in New England, where he tried to use that skill that he had, the racial customs of the day said, oh no, no colored men sail as captain here. No, no, we don't do that. So this was the system, excuse me, against which black people struggled. Robert Smalls, you might have heard of him. He was a slave sailor in Charleston, South Carolina. Turned out to have a marvelous career after the war as a politician, a congressman, and the rest. But as a young man, he's a slave working on the waterfront in Charleston. During the Civil War, he and his men took this Confederate gunboat, the Planter. They steamed it out past Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor and turned it over to the Union Navy, a bold strike for freedom for themselves and a real thrust against the Confederacy. So this was how black men were taking charge of their lives with these maritime skills they had. And boys like this hanging out on the waterfront, you know, they'd hear these stories and they'd hear different things. They understood that there were jobs aboard ship for black men and often aboard whaling ships. Whaling was dirty work. It was pretty disgusting work. It was like industry at sea with a lot of blood and violence. But here, lots and lots of images of black men whaling. The third man from the right in this picture is clearly an African-American sailor rowing that boat as the harpooner is spearing this whale. Another image here with a black man at the top of the picture, an enraged sperm whale crushing their boat. Another image here, you know, it's like, man, whaling's sort of dangerous. I don't think I want to do this. You know, try cargo ships, it's better. But my point is, once again, hiding in plain sight, lots and lots of images of men of color in the whaling trades. My favorite is this one, Captain Absalom Boston. He was a Nantucket man, Massachusetts man, black man, one of the few free men of color who rose to command a whaling ship. And in the 1830s, he posed for this picture painting. It's marvelous. He's dressed in the white shirt and tie of the successful New England ship captain. But he's dressed in these big gold hoop earrings that only a black man in the 1830s in America would wear, okay? And so he is comfortable in two skins. He's comfortable with multiple identities. He wants the world to know that he is proud of being a black man and wearing these big earrings that no white ship captain would have worn. And yet he's got the white suit and the white shirt and tie of the successful captain. When the war came, the Civil War, a number of slaves, many slaves in the Low Countries, Carolina and Georgia and elsewhere, flocked to the Union Navy to fight for Jubilee. We have another man here on an ironclad, the Monitor. And it was these black boatmen who understood the waterways in Carolinas, Georgia, Chesapeake Bay, who assisted the Union forces to get up those rivers and take over. You might know your Civil War history that the Confederacy never controlled its own coast. The Union fleet blockaded it, and the Union fleet was helped in many, many ways by local black watermen who knew the rivers and the waterways. But after the war, black men found increasingly they were the last hired and the first fired aboard ship. 1860s is a very different situation than the 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. The American Merchant Marine after the American Revolution was expanding, creating jobs for free black men and runaway slaves. But after the Civil War, the American shipping business was contracting, fewer jobs. Meanwhile, racist whites in the South wanted to keep black people attached to the land as sharecroppers to make a crop. So there's fewer black men flocking to the ports to get jobs. So it doesn't mean it was the end of black seafaring. You get men like Matthew Henson, raised a slave in Maryland who goes to the North Pole with Admiral Perry, actually drags Admiral Perry's Fanny to the North Pole. Henson was an extraordinary seaman. You get people like Marcus Garvey, who starts the Black Star steamship line. You get black intellectuals like Langston Hughes, who ships out after the First World War and writes an autobiography, which he calls The Big Sea. But my larger point is that for the larger group of black Americans, there are fewer jobs at sea, except in whaling. As shipping got less important in the economy, whale ships are a last vestige of like a dying era. Okay, now the modern thing is steam-powered cargo ship. So these bloody, butchering whale ships, well, Black people often found jobs in what were the least desirable positions for some whites. So here's a very cool set of images. These are photographs taken in 1905 in Antarctica aboard a New Bedford whale ship, this one. And they're glass plate lantern slides. And they're sent back to the Museum of Natural History and they're hand tinted. So I'm going to show you right now, it's about half a dozen images that are color photographs from 1905, the tail end of the age of sail, but with a number of Black men working aboard these whale ships here in a, they've harpooned a whale and they're being pulled along in what's called a Nantucket sleigh ride. Here, a man on deck is cutting the blubber off of a whale. These are Azorian men, Cape Verdean men, West Indian men, Black American men, sharpening tools, cleansing the blubber, cutting the blubber off a chunk of a whale up on the deck. And here bailing out the spermaceti, which is a valuable oil from the head case of a sperm whale, Black men crowding along the rail. So the point is that the last gasp of Black seamen working the age of sail was when the age of sail was sort of on its last legs. So we have a chap like this. He's a whaleman from the New Bedford bark Sunbeam. This is the 1880s. I'd like to think of him as a descendant, sort of fictionally, but of people like Hola, Acquiano, who had been a sailor in the Atlantic a century before. This young man is out in the world. He's a free Black American guy, the 1880s. Slavery is over, but it's the era of Jim Crow. And he poses for a formal portrait in St. Helena at a portrait studio, whether for his mother, his girlfriend, himself to remember when he was young and at sea, who knows? But he was out there doing it. So if you ever hear from anybody that like the only stories that link historic Black people and historic sailing ships are stories of slave ships, you can point up a lot of alternatives. There's, incredible stories of Hola, Equiano, who wrote his own narrative, one of the first great Black authors in English. The story of Watson the shark and how race worked aboard ships. Men at the masthead, men at the oars, Black men at the helm. These are men connecting the brothers and sisters of the African diaspora. These are men making themselves out of the circumstances of their own lives, what any of us can do, right? You do the best you can in the circumstances you find. But these are men steering for the horizon, steering for a better day for themselves, hopefully, and for Black people as a whole. That, my friends, is a very synoptic, short version of a Black Jack's book on African-American seafaring. I have lots of little bits about Savannah and Georgia and other pieces. I can talk about a lot of other things, but I thought we could open it for questions and see if people have things they'd like to raise or what we want to talk about. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, those of you who have joined us tonight, please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat for us. We will get to those in a second. And while we wait for those, Dr. Bolster, I got a couple questions for you or comments. Maybe you can give us a lesson on this as well. We know that during the American Revolution, naval service in the Continental Navy and naval service with the Royal Navy, we know the Royal Navy at times provided amnesty for folks who maybe would have jumped to the Royal Navy. Can you talk about did we see a lot of African Americans in the colonies at that time that would have jumped to the Royal Navy seeking that amnesty, perhaps with that win that they were hoping for?
Yeah, we certainly have Black men who enlisted in the Continental Navy and Black men who enlisted in some of the individual provincial or state navies during the Revolution. There are certainly Black American men in the Royal Navy. I found much more evidence, Todd, later, of Black American men being impressed by the British and forced to serve in the Royal Navy against their will. I often found evidence, and I tell stories in this book about the Royal Navy coming up alongside a cargo ship underway or coming alongside a cargo ship in a port in Spain or somewhere, going forcibly on board and grabbing men to take, forcible impressment to go serve in the Navy. And sometimes grabbing Black men, sometimes grabbing white men. As a white sailor says, trading us white guys for Black guys, we're just treated like slaves. So men in the Royal Navy often felt like slaves. I found a wonderful cache of letters, 14 letters written by African Americans that are in the State Department archives now, who were 14 men impressed by the Navy in the early 1800s, forced to serve against their will. And they wrote these testimonials about where they were from and who their children were and all this stuff to demonstrate they were Americans. It was great about them. It didn't get them out of the Navy.
Yeah, that was my next question as well. My next comment for you is that we know about the impressment on the seas as well too. We know sometimes that vessels that were overtaken on the high seas, captains would have grabbed folks off those ships, perhaps tried to sell them. We know that there are some Admiralty courts that try to protect some of these sailors as well. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Admiralty courts could work both ways. There were black men who went to court to make a case that they were free and that they'd been impressed, or that they were free and they were stolen and then sold as slaves. And sometimes the court sided with the black men and sometimes they did not. And that was true in the 18th century and well into the 19th century. And so there's, again, in my book, there's lots of examples of this in both centuries of black men being forced against their will to work on ships and trying to get out using the courts, or black men at times running to ships because it was better than the situation in which they encountered themselves. But court records were actually very important to me reconstructing part of the story.
So is that just an opportunity for profiteering? Is that all it was those folks trying to grab them? And I don't know what else to call it, other than profiteering.
If white people saw black men as less than fully human, or they saw black men as able to be commodities and to be sold, then an unscrupulous white man, whether it was a pirate captain or a Royal Navy captain or a cargo ship captain from Rhode Island, whatever it was, an unscrupulous white man could try to seize a black sailor and sell him in another port. And so, unfortunately, this went on quite a bit. So we have black men going to sea to try to get out of situations they didn't like, but knowing that once they were there, they would face the potential threat of kidnapping and sail into a slave society.
Yeah, and so clearly ships could have represented freedom for folks as well, but there were other economic opportunities for folks. You know, we talked about a couple of those folks, and I know a couple parts in the book. You had mentioned Crispus Attucks as a sailor. Do we know much about him as a sailor and what his life and what his role was on board ships at that time?
No, not a great deal. It's just that he was a sailor. You know, Crispus Attucks was the first martyr of the American Revolution. In some ways, he was shot during the quote Boston massacre, when a group of Bostonians, sailors, blacks, whites, saucy boys, and sort of artisanal troublemakers challenged the British forces who were occupying Boston on the eve of the Revolution. So what we know about Attucks is that he was a sailor of African and Native American descent, and that he was killed by the British and thus made a martyr of by the Americans.
Yeah. Okay, I didn't know if there was additional information about him. I was not aware of anything, and I was hoping that maybe you had a little more insight so we knew a little bit more about him and his life and his role in our history here in America as well. A couple of times you did mention the Negro Seamen Acts in the book. Will you talk about what those were and what were those protections for Negro seamen, or were they protections for I'm trying to get my head clear on what the Negro Seamen Acts were.
No, anything but. Okay, so in 1822, you may have heard of Denmark Vesey. He was a slave in Charleston, South Carolina, who had actually become free, won his freedom in a lottery. And he was a revolutionary. Denmark Vesey wanted to strike a blow for freedom and have blacks in Charleston and South Carolina rise up. He had been to sea as a young man, quite a bit around the Atlantic and the Caribbean, been to Haiti and other places. And he knew that the Haitians had made a successful revolution against the whites. So Vesey cooked up this plot, and ultimately he was betrayed by an untrustworthy conspirator, and Vesey and about 30 of his followers were executed in Charleston. He refused to talk, but others in his group did talk before execution and said that Vesey had been a seaman, that seamen had been in spreading incendiary pamphlets, that the intention was for the successful slave revolutionaries in Charleston to take ship and go to Haiti, et cetera, et cetera. So the authorities in Charleston in 1822 passed a law called the Negro Seamen Acts. It said any sailor coming into Charleston, any free sailor, black sailor, man of color on a ship would be put in jail. And he would stay in jail until his ship was to leave, and he or his captain had to pay the cost of his incarceration. And this was the South Carolinian magistrates' attempt to keep free blacks who they felt were spreading liberty from their slaves. And after a while, all the other southern states, one after the other, adopted laws like this, including Georgia and including Louisiana, et cetera, et cetera. So the ports like Savannah, Charleston, New Orleans, that had once had quite a few free black sailors working in them, the numbers went down. When I reconstructed these numbers from those crew lists, I could see that the numbers in Georgia, the numbers in Savannah, before the Negro Seamen Acts took place there in the 1830s, were about 12% of the crews were black. And after the Negro Seamen Acts, that fell to 1 or 2%. Okay, so there's a real move here. But in the meantime, hundreds, I can't remember now, thousands. I have in the book, I can't remember. Black men, free black men from the Caribbean and the North who sailed into southern ports on ships were incarcerated simply for being black and a sailor. So those acts were very, very grim for free sailors at a time when cotton was the most important commodity in American shipping. And every year, thousands of northern free sailors from New York and Baltimore and elsewhere sailed into southern ports.
Right. Well, thank you for that clarification for me. Still nothing in the chat, and I've got a dog that's barking, so hopefully it's not too loud here. One more question that I have for you through my notes as I read through the book. What part and roles did African-American seamen have in the abolition movement?
Yeah, that's hard to nail down exactly. We certainly know, I mean, there's dramatic instances. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world. David Walker was a free man born in North Carolina of a slave father and a free mother. He ultimately got to Boston. He's running a used clothing store in Boston, but he's a revolutionary. And he writes this book, a pamphlet, a sort of a 120 page book, crying out for Black Americans to strike a blow for their liberty. And he wanted blood, and he wanted the system to fail. And he ultimately, it appears, got a number of sailors to smuggle copies of this tract into Richmond, Savannah, New Bern, North Carolina, other southern ports. And the authorities went nuts. The state of Georgia put a bounty on his head. They said, dead or alive, $10,000 if you kill this guy or bring him to us. And ultimately, David Walker, the free black man in Boston, was murdered outside his shop, and no one really knows exactly how. But the point there is that it appears that sailors of color were smuggling this pamphlet into Savannah and other places. There's other ways that the freedom struggle worked, the abolition movement. In 1818, a slave in Savannah named William Grimes was working as a stevedore, loading cotton on a ship to go north. And there were free black sailors in that crew. And Grimes started to hang with these guys and basically let them know that he wanted to escape. And as he wrote later in a book, I went ashore that night with one of these free black sailors, and I bought some provisions, some beef, and got some water and biscuits. And they hid me in a place in amongst the cotton bales. And once the ship got to sea, they gave 3 cheers to let me know I was safe. And a week or so later, the ship arrived in New York, and he got safely ashore. So there are these situations like this. That's a story from Savannah. They occurred elsewhere as well, with enslaved men getting out through the connivance and assistance of free black sailors on board ships. Now, this didn't always work. Sometimes the free black sailors were concerned to have to cover their own fanny, and they would turn in guys who were trying to escape. But there were clearly some black sailors involved in the movement for freedom and in different ways.
Well, you must have read my mind because I had William Grimes written in my notes here.
Okay.
And I was just going to say, will you tell us a story of his stowaway and his freedom? We have one note here in the chat. It says, with sailors traveling up and down the coastline or around the world, were there ever opportunities for sailors to make money? Was there evidence direct selling to the people on land?
Yeah, it's a good question. I quantified wages on a number of ships out of northern ports where I found better wage records. And it turns out that Black able-bodied seamen were paid equal to the white able-bodied seamen in most instances. It turns out that Black cooks got paid more than the white ordinary seamen. So the Black men in the cooking role were considered to be a little higher ranking. There was also a situation in which sailors, especially in the 18th century, could trade on their own. They would have a little space on the ship in their own sea chest or in the hold. And so Hola, Equiano talked about trading like this and making money by bringing things to trade one island to the next. There are also instances, my book mostly dealt with the period where sailors were in the Atlantic and Caribbean, but later I found men of color, American Blacks, working on ships, got out into the Pacific. I talked a little bit about that, but they often would marry Polynesian women and start bars or shops on Pacific islands, okay? And so another way to make money. So there were a few Black seamen like Captain Paul Cuffey, who became quite well-to-do, owning and running ships. A few Black former seamen like James Fortin, who ran a big sail loft in Philadelphia and made quite a bit of money as a sail maker. But for the most part, sailors were working class guys. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're just getting by. They're moving around. I did a lot with trying to chart residential stability for sailors and their families. These were not well-to-do men for the most part. No.
There we go. Hang on, I got one more in the chat here. How often would insurance companies work with Black staff ships? Did we have records of insurance companies and what their thoughts were with insuring these vessels?
No records that I use specifically where insurers were saying it matters one way or the other if your crew is largely white or largely Black or whatever. However, in the federal courts, the U.S. Admiralty Courts, whose records I used quite a bit, when you would end up with shipwrecks, for instance, there's a story, got to remember this guy's name, I think it was Auguste Lemonnier, was a free Black man who was a sailor and was in Savannah at times, he was in St. Thomas at times, he was in Haiti, different places. At one point, he was on an American ship that was going, I think, to Mobile, but it wrecked on the Carysfort Reef in Florida, wrecked in the Florida Keys. And so when that happens, you end up getting insurance companies involved, and then there's testimony. And part of how I learned about Auguste Lemonier's story, how he presented himself and the rest, was through these documents in an insurance settlement about that shipwreck. So I didn't use insurance company records specifically. I didn't look for insurance company records, but I found insurance company records in the Admiralty Court records that had to do with other cases about salvage and that sort of thing.
Perfect. Whoa, we're getting questions trickling in here. Piracy was a problem for everyone. Was there a record of Black pirates during this age in America as well? And I'm glad that question came in and that's from Lisa Bones. And I'm glad she brought that up because I was thinking about that. And I remember reading a book about Black pirates, and it's been years ago, and I can't remember the title now, but if you can talk about piracy for us.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Good question. So the quote, Golden Age of Piracy ended around 1722. But in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the Brotherhood of the Coast, as it was called, was operating on the East Coast, in North Carolina, in Long Island Sound, and out in the Indian Ocean. And there are a number of instances in which Black men rose up pretty high amongst the pirates. There are other instances in which white pirates had no compunction at all about selling Black sailors into slavery. So it sort of worked in different ways. There was one cruise in which a group of pirates, white and Black, captured a slave ship that was coming from Africa, had a number of people on board, and they basically took all the women, the young girls from this slave ship, and went off on, you know, a Saturnalia, what they called the Bachelor's Delight Cruise. I'm sure it was just a scene of rape. There are other instances in which Black men became a quartermaster, which is like the second highest ranking position on a pirate ship. And we have documents about that in North Carolina, in Long Island, New York, and in the Indian Ocean. So there was certainly a role for Black men in piracy. And it's important that we understand we don't romanticize it too much and think that pirates were egalitarian. They were not. They were often rather dirty, bloodthirsty fellows. But that sometimes Black men could make a go of it in that society and actually rise quite high. So it worked really well for some Blacks and really badly for other Blacks.
Yeah, and I know one of our other colleagues, Christina, has put together a resource list for us as well. So that'll be noted for folks to take a look at as well. Dr. Bolster, we want to thank you so very much for your time tonight. Thank you very much for this lesson, this important lesson, one that I don't know if we would call it a micro history of African-American stories as well. This is certainly a story that coming into me reading the book, I was not familiar with and not aware of, other than our initial conversation where I had come across the story of Black Hands, White Sails by Patricia and Frederick McKissick about African-American whalers as well too. But again, I enjoyed the book. We do have a copy here in the Fulton County system for folks to check out. So I will return the book to the library tomorrow. So if you want to place it on hold, please place it on hold. We'll get it through the system for folks to pick up and read. We got one more note here in the chat. We get a big thank you as well coming in for you. So again, we appreciate your time, your energy tonight with us as well. As sailors out there, we're looking for calm seas and red skies at night for sailors' delight. So we want to wish you all the best for joining us tonight. This recording will get posted and we'll replay it again through our probably our Facebook page as well. We'll send a note out to you when we're going to replay this as well. And some folks may have some questions and comments through there. Maybe you can comment back and forth. There's those questions so people might pick it up.
Yeah. If people have questions, if you can provide my email address. I gave that to Vicki. If people write me an email with a question, I'll be able to answer it.
Well, again, we appreciate your time tonight. Thank you again so very much for your time tonight. All of you joining us tonight, we thank you for your time joining us here as well, the Fulton County Library System, and have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.